today's material introduces another fallacy. And remember what fallacies are. They're bad arguments of a certain kind that have been made so many times by so many people that they're easily identifiable. They have a certain structure to them. This one has to do with the idea of authority, or another term that your book uses is experts, right? And you rely on authority or experts, and you have to in your life. You couldn't live in modern industrial, technological civilization without relying on authorities a lot of the time. One prime example, you don't do your own medicine, do you? Some people may self-medicate, they call it that, but can you actually prescribe yourself medication if you need it? Can you diagnose yourself? With some things, perhaps. I've got the flu. Do you really know if you do have the flu?
We got WebMD for that. And they don't.
Yeah, WebMD for that, yeah. But WebMD is relying on sort of a stand-in authority or expert. Although, we talked about this before, hypochondriacs should avoid WebMD, right? When you go to build a house, there are authorities on that. Some people handle certain parts of it. The electrician, if the electrician wants things to run a certain way, you probably shouldn't argue with him or her. I've known some people who've done their own wiring, and sometimes it turns out good, and sometimes it doesn't turn out quite so good. You flip the switch and you get a shock. It turns out it wasn't grounded. You don't argue with a carpenter about whether the stud should be this far apart or whether you'd like them this far apart. We've talked about some of these things before. And last class, when we had Kevin Dilley come in and give the talk about journalism, one of the things he pointed out the journalist's job to do is actually to find an expert. They're not supposed to just come to their own conclusions on things that require expertise. So you rely on experts quite often. Much of the news media that you're reading or watching or listening to is using experts. You're being taught by people that are supposed to be experts, right? Sometimes it turns out a professor doesn't actually have a degree. We've talked about those sort of situations before. Pretty rare these days. But there are people who set themselves up as experts, and they may not actually be so. So you have to be kind of careful. And there's a lot of appeals that people make to experts that turn out to be fallacious. So what we want to look at is what actually constitutes expertise? What makes a person an expert? We know that we rely on them. That's pretty clear. But what actually makes somebody an expert? And your book actually gives you some guidelines for this. It says, how do you judge a person's expertise? So what does it tell you? There's actually 5 factors that this book goes into. A little bit more extensive than some textbooks. What makes somebody an expert? Yeah?
Their experience.
Experience, yeah. And your book doesn't really spell this out so well. Experience in what? We all have experience, right?
Isn't it in that topic or that field?
Yeah. Experience in the field, relevant areas. So, if somebody is going to claim to be an expert on Mesoamerican archaeology, they're not, let's say they're an archaeologist, but they've only worked on Southeast Asian sites. They're probably not an expert in Mesoamerican archaeology. We haven't actually worked in that area. What else, though? What else do you? Experience is one important part.
Accomplishments.
What's that?
Accomplishments.
Yeah, that's a little bit lower. We'll keep that. Accomplishments. What else before we get to that? This is sort of a gatekeeper function in a lot of fields, where if you don't have this, you can't put yourself out as being an expert. What's that?
Degree.
Yeah, a degree, and more broadly speaking, a degree signifies what? Starts with an E.
Education.
Education, right. And usually education is signified by certain degrees. So if you want somebody who's qualified to teach college, you need a master's at least to teach college. And most colleges want PhDs or a terminal master's, like an MFA or an MBA. Accomplishments, that's right too. What else? Your book gives you a few more.
Reputation.
Reputation, right. So we have education, experience, accomplishments, reputation, and there was one other in here. No, I'm blanking on it. I'll remember as we go through. Now, education. What does that consist in? It could be degrees. What else could it be? If you're in the trades, actually you do have to go to college for some of the trades these days. I've got a cousin and an uncle who are iron workers, and they actually have to go to college to be iron workers. They get paid to go, which is kind of nice, but they go while they're doing 10 to 12-hour days, 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week, and then they go to college 1 day a week. My uncle's actually making straight A's. Pretty good for a guy who just had a college degree and hasn't been in school for a long time, but he's a hard worker. What else do you need though? Let's say you wanted to be in a trade. What would you have to do?
Practice.
Apprenticeship.
Apprenticeship. Yeah, practice is experience. Apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is kind of like experience, but it's also, there's some sort of conferral that goes on. There's actually some governing body that says, okay, this person is actually an apprentice, this person is actually a journeyman, this person is actually a master's. They have certain criteria for that. Oftentimes you'll have to take certifying exams. How many of you are going into fields like nursing, or your pre-med, or let's see what else. Anybody thinking of law school or being a paralegal? What else do we have? Education, you have to do a lot of certifying exams for that. Actually, they have certifying exams even for things like barber in some states. That's a matter of education. So, your book tells you education includes but is not strictly limited to formal education, the possession of degrees from established institutions. Now, you can actually sometimes get diplomas from places that are called diploma mills. So, education by itself may not be the only, thing that would constitute being an expert. It also talks about experience, both the kind and the amount. Right? So it has to be relevant experience. You also you want to see as much experience as possible. Accomplishments. So what are accomplishments? What are examples of that?
Awards and stuff? Awards?
Yeah, the awards could be, well, actually that could also fit into reputation.
Like projects, completed like a portfolio, I guess.
Okay, portfolio, that's a good example, especially for students. Any of you that are going into, like education, any of you that are going into the arts, In the humanities, you know, if you're going to be in English, you want to be a writer, you probably should be assembling a portfolio as a student. People are going to want to see what you've done. Internships are a way of acquiring experience, but they can also be an accomplishment. My sister, when she was a social worker, when she was a social work student, she actually handled cases. She was put into a juvenile intake system and handled cases and followed up on them. That would be experience, but that's also accomplishments. You know, you look to see what sort of successes the person has. So, and you could put these into a portfolio. These are the sort of things that you actually list on your resume, or if you're an academic, on what we call a curriculum vitae. You can see mine on my website. It lists not just where I got my education or where I've taught, but also what I've done. For a college professor, you know, this is kind of a dirty little secret. There's a lot of things that count for accomplishments, but the thing that they care about the most, what do you think it is? Even in teaching places like this. Well, if you had to guess.
Where your degree came from?
Well, that's education. That's important, actually, because that opens up doors or closes doors. There is kind of a class system in academia. So if you went to the wrong schools, you may find some doors closed. Accomplishments. What sort of things do your professors do behind the scenes that you pop into their office?
Don't you guys have to like get published and stuff like that?
Yes, publications. We go to conferences too, and quite often when we go to the conferences, it's either to work on a publication, you know, we're writing it and we want to get some feedback, or we've already published it and now we have to defend it against our opponents and detractors, or explain it, or somebody's milking it to try to get some mileage out of it, as we say. That's important. So articles, books, to a lesser extent book reviews, things like that. Those are considered important in academia. Those are accomplishments. And it really does take a lot of work to write an article that gets peer reviewed. Or to write a book. You know, if you get a PhD, you've written 2 books along the way. You wrote a master's thesis. My master's thesis was about 110 pages or so. Pretty short book. And then my dissertation was around 460 pages. Never published it because in my eyes, it wasn't very good. Or it wasn't very readable. A lot of professors, their first book will be they'll take their dissertation, which they did as part of their education, and turn it into an accomplishment. When you do that, you have to send it to a publishing house, and it's a very harrowing process because you get rejected quite often. When you send out articles or book proposals, usually you get it back and they say, we don't want this. Sometimes they're mean and they say, this is garbage. And then you have to deal with that. So yeah, that's one set of accomplishments. What else do your professors do that you would relate to more easily, that you could see as accomplishments? What are some of the things?
How well he teaches us?
Yeah, and we try to gauge that by, things like teaching evaluations, which are not a great predictor. I usually, what I pay attention to in teaching evaluations, actual written comments. I ignore all the numbers myself because they're meaningless. They vary from class to class where I taught the same thing the same way. They depend on how the student felt that day, And now the way that we've got it set up, you guys are stuck taking sometimes 7 evaluations in a row online, 50 questions each. Not good predictors. How else can you tell who's a good professor? What are some things that in your experience here at FSU, a professor has done or some professors have done that impressed you? Doesn't have to be in the classroom. Anything that a professor has done that's impressed you.
The teaching?
Yeah. What else?
Leniency.
Leniency? That's not really something that you want to include as an
Not
accomplishment?
sorority membership, things like that.
Okay, so supporting, being an advisor to a sorority or a fraternity or some other club, right? Doing that well. That could be an accomplishment. That's why often they give awards. Sometimes they just give awards to give awards.
I think years experience too says a lot.
What's that?
Like how long they've been at that university, because like, I
Yeah.
know I had a couple professors that were like senior professors, they'd been there for like 25 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And you just had a higher respect for them, and I think it just helped get their message across easier.
It's kind of an interesting thing to say. So
I
they
guess
had
it-
experience
I
there.
guess it would
Why did you have
go
higher
on-
respect for them?
Huh?
Why did you have higher respect for them?
I don't know, I guess it's because you think about they've been there 25 years doing the same thing, it must have gotten them someplace.
One hopes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, that would be more experience than accomplishments. Your professors, whether you realize it or not here at FSU, many of them are bringing in very innovative teaching and learning techniques into the classroom. And they actually have to go off somewhere and study those. We have writing intensive classes, reading across the curriculum, information literacy, the CLA at FSU, a whole bunch of different initiatives that we've done. And you may not realize it, but those are accomplishments. Let's widen it now. Think about the careers that you're going into. What will actually count as accomplishments for you besides getting your degree? Getting a job, that's not really an accomplishment when you look to somebody for expertise. That just means that you got your foot in the door. What do you do once you've got your job that would make other people say, yeah, that person actually gets things done, important things?
Getting promoted.
Getting promoted that's something you get because of that. But getting promoted is not by itself an accomplishment.
Doing your job good.
Being able to apply for what you've learned from the university in the job? Or
Yeah,
the
these are good generic things. Let's take particular subjects. Let's take a business person. What counts as an accomplishment for a business person? If you want to look to see whether somebody is worth listening to, because remember, that's what being an expert means.
additional certifications or?
Oh, that's education. See, I think that in our society, this indicates something. In our society, we're very fuzzy about this. It wasn't always like that. It used to be that education mattered less than accomplishments. They didn't care where you had your degree from, so long as you could produce, not just do your job, but produce results that people cared about. The other things like reputation, your book also talks about positions, right? So if you get a promotion, you're getting a new position, right? Positions that you hold. If people elect you to be the chair, or they elect you to their governing body. I actually ran for a philosophical association several years ago. I didn't actually get it. A lot of it, I wasn't very well known. But those sort of things come later. See, this is the stuff that happens before. These are the rewards. This is the linchpin between them. Actually being able to perform, to do something, to get something done. If you don't have a clear conception of that in your field, you're probably not going to be successful. Because today, the marketplace is really, really rough. Even if you get a job, you have to hold that job and you have to prosper in that job. That's part of what we're trying to train you for here at FSU. And so you have to start thinking about, in my field, what are going to count as accomplishments? Let's think about another field besides business. Usually, that one's pretty easy to think of. What about a doctor? What might their accomplishments be? How do you tell if they're a good doctor or not?
Patients. How many patients?
Reputation is something different than accomplishments. How many patients? You're on the right track. How many patients what?
compared to that doctor?
Again, that's a matter of reputation.
Or how many patients the doctor has cured out?
There you go. That's perfect. Because that's something that the doctor's actually done. The fact that a lot of people go to them, that by itself doesn't mean anything.
But then you get the technicality of, okay, what's cured, what's
That's
fixed,
fine.
what's...
Yeah, that's
So how do you
that's
determine what
A-okay.
the
We don't have
accomplishment
to worry about that at this point. Right now, we're just using this as an
But
example.
how do you determine what that would be then?
Well, you can look at cure rates, and you can any sort of statistic you can always quibble about it and say I need to see the methodology and where the sample came from and all that. But if we're just doing sort of basic level stuff here and just thinking about what counts as an accomplishment for a doctor, and we're not getting into it with great rigor, how many people they've actually healed
So it's
or
like
cured?
productivity.
What's that?
It's like productivity.
Yeah, productivity for a worker could be a means or an index for accomplishments. Writing a really good report, that's an accomplishment. I got into, I found doors opening for me here at FSU when I wrote a really good report where I reviewed a grant proposal that had been somewhat poorly written and it had started some controversies within the school. And people saw that I could write reports well. It wasn't that I had experience, that wasn't coming from my education, and I didn't have a reputation. I did something, and then people started taking notice. So yeah, productivity. You notice who actually does the job at work consistently, every day. Who actually heals patients. A doctor might invent a new technique. That would be an accomplishment, right? A business person might start a company. That's a great index for entrepreneurship. Can they actually do it? Anybody can take the class. Anybody can be around for a while looking at things, and they can have reputation, or they can have positions. There's a lot of people who get positions who quite frankly, don't deserve their positions. It's whether they actually do anything, whether they actually have any accomplishments. These things open the door so you can start doing this, because this is what matters in life. This other stuff is nice. This is the gravy. This is the meat. Accomplishments. What you can do, how you perform. So you should ask yourself that of experts that you're tempted to rely on. What have they actually done? What can you point at and say, yeah, this person actually produces results? There's plenty of people that have PhDs that quite frankly, haven't done anything worthwhile with that PhD. They just show up and, stumble through their classes. So business people, what else might be a good index? Taking a failing company and turning it around.
Like how many accounts they've signed? Like
Yeah.
Your representative?
If you are going into business and you're doing, say, marketing or what else would sales, you're going to be measured by how many accounts you have and how many things you close. There's this great movie called Glengarry Glen Ross. A lot of profanity. It's a David Mamet film, and so people are dropping the F-bomb all the time. And it's a very cutthroat business environment, and the boss says to them, ABC. What does ABC mean? Always be closing. And that means be producing accomplishments. This is the thing that really sets experts apart. You can get a lot of talking heads who have great education, people like, and people have been promoting them. You got to ask, what have they done? You can think about this for other fields too. But let's go on and let's talk about reputation. So, reputation to who? This is a key thing. Reputation to everybody? Is that what makes somebody an expert? If that's the case, then Oprah's an expert. Oprah's not an expert, except on one thing, how to run a media empire. Whose reputation should you care about? Or whose approval should you care about when it comes to an expert? People in your field or people in their field? Your field might be education, but if we're talking about an expert in medicine,
No, you want it in your field.
yeah, no, not in your field, their field. You guys might be using your in the sort of generic, universal sense, where we say you instead of one, or.
Like if I'm going into medicine, I'm gonna look at medicine experts.
Yes, if you are in the same field as the expert.
Yeah.
Remember, most of the experts we rely on are not in our fields. That's why we rely on them. So we call these people their peers. You guys are all peers to each other. You're all on the same level. When it comes to evaluating whether somebody's a good teacher or not, yeah, we have these student evaluations. You know what else we do? We send other professors in to check up on them, to watch. Now sometimes this process gets subverted and everybody gets a 5. You know, sort of like everybody gets a gold star. You remember some classes like that? That's not the way it should be. It should be that your peers evaluate you, and if you're a real expert, your peers should hold you in some esteem. And if you want to find out who's a good professor and who's not a good professor here on this campus, go and have candid conversations with other professors. They may not actually give you the straight dope on some other professors. I myself, I don't like to say negative things about other professors because there's already so many negative things said. But there's plenty of people who will tell you, straight out, yeah, that person, I don't know what they're doing here. They don't seem to know their subject. You see, you don't know whether they don't know their subject or not until you actually know their subject. But if you want to know if a historian knows their subject, ask another historian. If you suspect that their views may be way out in left field, or right field for that matter, ask another person in their field. See what their reputation is. The History Channel runs a lot of specials on religion, and they bring in experts to talk about it. A lot of those experts are kooks. They're not, I know this because I'm a scholar in religious studies as well as philosophy. A lot of those people are not in the mainstream. They don't have a good reputation among their peers. As a matter of fact, they have a bad reputation for being sloppy scholars. The History Channel puts them on, you know why? Because kooks will say really entertaining things. They'll come out and tell you, yeah, we have evidence that Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene under this tree right here. Nobody has anything remotely like that. All we know about the guy, basically, is what we've got in a few ancient texts. Some of them we have a lot of copies of, some of them we only have a few copies of. And the scholars actually work with those. They don't sort of, imagine things and then start presenting those as scholarship. Same thing with business. If you're going into business, well, think about this. If you want to partner with somebody who offers you a chance to go in a partnership with them, don't just ask, mom, pop, the neighborhood people. Ask other business people, hey, does this business plan look like a good proposition to you? Or does this look kind of dicey? Does this person actually, do they know their stuff? Bring them to dinner with another business person. Have them sit down. And then after they leave the room, say, what do you think? Are they really an expert? Right? Positions, I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. If you're given a position of authority in some sort of field, that's usually seen as being a sign of expertise. But again, it could be, by itself, you shouldn't take that just as a sign. It might be political. Some people get promoted for political reasons. Right? They were in the right place at the right time with the right, qualifications. Could be any sort of thing. It could even be they were doing the kind of scholarship that was considered sexy at the time. That's a term that we use. Not in the same sense as you normally think about. It just means, something people want to read. You want to look for all of these. Once again, let me stress, these are sort of gatekeeper ones. You want somebody who actually does have If there's a relevant degree involved, you want somebody who's actually got that degree or training. You want somebody who's got some experience. These are nice to have. This is the most important thing, what they've actually done. That's going to be the most important thing for you, because what you're doing here at FSU is you are actually training to become an expert. That is why people will hire you. They're not going to hire you because you've got an FSU degree. They're not going to hire you because you were president of whatever club or anything like that. They're going to hire you because they've seen that you've done things like internships or what else. You guys all have portfolios, actually. You should start thinking about this.
Organizations you belong to?
Organizations that you belong to, and what have you actually done in the organization? I belong to some organizations and I haven't done anything, and I just sort of sit there, right? They're on my resume, but the ones that actually count that people care about are the ones where you've done something, where you've accomplished something. So keep that in mind. Now, the other thing that your book talks about is this fallacy. And the fallacy is usually called something like appeal to authority. Sometimes it's called the argument from authority. And sometimes it'll actually use the Latin name for it, ad authoritatem, but I'm not going to put that on the board. It's actually misnamed. This is where a lot of students get mixed up, unfortunately. If we wanted to rename it today, you know what I would actually rename it? I would call it the appeal to, and I would add one word, false authority. That's what I would call it. We don't call it that, so you have to read that in. It's not, anytime that a person mentions an authority, they are not making a fallacy. As a matter of fact, most authorities are good authorities. It's when the person isn't really an authority that we have a problem. So there's two possibilities for this. It could be that the person, they are an authority, is an authority, but not in the relevant field. Or it could be they're just not an authority at all. Think about when you guys were kids and there were popular kids, right? And what were the sort of things that popularity depended on and would take positions on? Clothes, music, whether belonging to this group or not was nerdy or fashionable. What else? Can you think of any other things? Who's in, who's out? That sort of stuff, right? And people would act, they would do appeals to authority. So-and-so says that this, this is the fashionable thing to wear now. Well, they don't know. They're just a kid. They're not an authority on anything. I mean, if there are authorities in fashion, I guess it would be like fashion designers or people who write for fashion magazines, or I don't know, because I don't know that world at all. Any of you in here do? Any of you have an idea who would be experts in that? Because I don't, frankly. But it's not some kid on the playground. So if somebody says, I've got to have this shirt because Billy so-and-so says that cool people are only wearing this clothes, that would be an appeal to authority, an appeal to false authority, because Billy so-and-so is not an authority on anything, let alone on fashion. When somebody says, well, my dad says that President Obama, and then ... whatever you want to put in there, unless your dad's a political scientist or he's an expert on the thing that Obama just took a position on, he's not an authority. It may be nice that he said something, you may agree with him, but if you're making an argument and you say, well, I know this is true because my dad said so, and you're assuming that your dad actually is an authority, aren't you? But if he's not, your dad probably is, or your uncle, or your mom, or, they most likely are an authority on something. And I don't just mean it in the sense that they're an authority in that they were in charge of you at a certain time. We're not using authority in that sense, right? They're an authority figure. If you come to me for if you come to my office hours and you say, Dr. Sadler, I've got this psychological problem and it's really dragging me down. And I say, oh, well, let me get out my notepad. Tell me all about it. I'm doing something wrong. And actually, so are you. Because I'm not an authority on psychology or counseling. I actually do know quite a bit about it because psychology came out of philosophy and I do work on psychoanalytic figures. But you shouldn't come to me because I don't have any certification, right? And I would be transgressing some rules anyway. The school actually tells us if somebody does that, we're supposed to send you to the counseling center, or they don't call it that here. There's some fancy name for it, but it's a counseling center. When they cite a Nobel Peace Prize winner on their views on economics, but they're not an economist, that's an appeal to false authority. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Nobel Prize winners are pretty humble people. You wouldn't catch Mother Teresa taking a stand on stuff that she doesn't know about. But some of them aren't quite so humble, and they'll be willing to opine, to say their ideas about something as if they are a genuine authority. They might have a degree, but it's not actually in the field that they're claiming to have expertise in. There are cases of people setting themselves up as therapists who don't have degrees.
It was a big thing for a while how there was a lot of yoga instructors going and getting certified. Because they had a bunch of online stuff that you can just go and get certified for, but people were walking out hurt.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
They did, it was just a simple test, and they had nothing to do with anything physical.
Yeah, so what was going on there? If we want to think about it in terms of argument, it would be something like this. My yoga teacher says, I'm trying to think of yogic postures that are really, the scorpion, right, where the person has got, they're on their forearms and they've got their legs actually bent over, so they're almost like in a C. I used to do yoga, I can't do that. So my yoga teacher says, I can do the scorpion. That's one premise, right? And another premise is my yoga teacher is an expert. Therefore, I can do it. And then you do it, and then something, you hear a pop, and you realize, oh, I better not move. And then when you do, you're in terrible pain. Well, that's because your yoga teacher wasn't actually an expert. This happens sometimes. Actually, experts can be wrong. No expert is absolutely infallible. Business models, for example. The successful business model from 1980 is probably not going to be a successful business model today, because the economy changes, people's tastes change. Or just think about fashion again. If somebody was a fashion expert back in the 90s, would you rely on them for what you ought to be buying now? Probably not. Although as a guy, I could, because how much the shirts change. What's that?
It all comes back around every 20 years anyway.
It's all in the background.
It's
No,
all
fashion starts back over every 20
Oh yeah, with the retro trends. What were you
years.
saying?
What was in the 80s?
It's coming back right now, so.
But you notice it's not exactly the same. It'll be a little bit, it'll put a little twist on it.
They'll change the color, that's about it.
Yeah. So now, keep this in mind. What is the argument from authority? Argument from false authority. It's when somebody isn't really an authority in the field. They're an authority in some field, but not in the one that you're looking at. Or they're just not an expert. They may be putting themselves out as an expert. The other person may be presenting them as if they're an expert. But just saying that you're an expert doesn't make you so. You want to look for those 5 characteristics that we talked about. Experience, education, accomplishments, reputation, and positions. Experts may not have all of those. So the ones that you want to look at the most are actually the first 3. Education, experience, accomplishments. And that, you know, if they have the other 2, that's good. What do you do when experts disagree? This is the last thing we're going to end with and then finish class. What do you do when experts disagree? Do you just pick the expert that you like and go with them? Is that the smart thing to do?
Consider their arguments.
Well, consider their arguments. Let's say you don't have a good reason to decide either one of them. What do? What does a critical thinker do? Flip a coin?
Get another expert's opinion.
That's a good possibility. You could get another expert's opinion and go with where the consensus is. Until you can do that, what you ought to do is what we call withholding assent. You back off from it, you say, yeah, I don't know. It's okay to do that.
It's called what?
Withholding assent. It means that you don't throw yourself into it and say, yeah, I'm on this side or I'm on this side. Because if you don't have good reason to believe something, and having an expert say something who's a real expert is a good reason to believe it. But if the experts conflict, it's very difficult sometimes to tell who's the real expert, who actually is right about this. Sometimes you have 2 people who are very good experts in the same field, and they interpret the data differently. Right? They can have legitimate differences. In that case, the best thing to do is to withhold assent.